I see Canadians, yes. So we are Canadians, and we are ready to live stream our first dev Q&A for the Warframe community.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Total Biscuit. I'm here to ask and answer one simple question. WTF is Warframe?
Should I open it?
Without question, Warframe is one of the most fascinating games I have ever encountered because of the boldness of its design choices and the technical competence with which it executes on those choices.
Sisters below.
Yeah, I mean, we have 26 million registered loot.
Warframe is a complete mess of game design and feature creep, with some of the best gameplay I've ever played.
10 years, Tenno. It's been 10 years, and those millions of registered losers have definitely added quite a lot to the ranks since that momentary slip by Rebecca. When we sit down and think about the lifespan of many games, you realise that a lot of them tend to last around a year, maybe more, a little bit more on top of that if they're lucky, especially if they're a free game. But every once in a while you come across a game that is so unique that it stands out from the crowd. It actually captures you. A game that evolves and caters to a niche enough audience that it allows that game to thrive. Not just barely surviving, but being incredibly successful at the same time. Warframe is one such game that has had quite a journey with a mixture of ups and downs over the years, but taking it all into stride and delivering one of the most unique gaming experiences that I've personally had in the last decade. Going from a well-documented underdog story due to a bunch of reasons to being a mainstay within the free-to-play live service gaming industry. In fact, at this stage, it's almost a blueprint for success that other free-to-play Western studios have tried to model themselves off. Like I said, it is well documented. Digital Extremes are a studio that almost closed its doors. People lost their jobs and Warframe was their last chance saloon, if you will. So the story goes that they pitched the idea of Warframe at GDC in 2012 and no publisher said yes. There was zero interest. Time and again, they were met with being told that the game was doomed to fail. Sci-fi wasn't popular enough, so they decided to put their fate in the sales of founders packs from a small dedicated community to help keep their doors open, and sales of the game kept on growing. Interest was definitely there, despite still being told that it was doomed to fail. But it didn't matter, that snowball at that point had started to roll. And that snowball had immense help from people like the late great Total Biscuit, who helped light the fuse on Warframe during those very early days with his WTF series, which covered Warframe on January the 7th, 2013. That's 2 months before the doors opened for open beta. It is one of many videos or reviews on YouTube that has helped drive curiosity toward Warframe, but it's always the first that many members of the Digital Extremes staff will reference. Total Biscuit got that ball rolling. Skill Up's review years down the line was another such a review, very reminiscent of Total Biscuit's format of providing the pros and the cons in a very unbiased manner, highlighting the problems that Warframe was suffering from, but also praising the good that it was doing as well. Initially, with the lack of publishers and of course major advertising, Warframe relied heavily on reviews coming from YouTube and of course any kind of social media. This is the early pitch footage from its original concept of Dark Sector Tenno. Of course, they would then go on to make Dark Sector itself as a separate game entirely, with Hidden Tenno within a very different setting, because publishers were still saying that they had to drop the sci-fi setting. But in this footage you can clearly see what looks like Grineer and Excalibur, even a yellow robot that looks very similar to the Jackal within Warframe. So Warframe as an idea was in their minds long before it ever became a reality. It was something that they were obviously very passionate about. And from a game that almost didn't happen due to publishers not wanting to touch it, it became a sleeper hit that no one was talking about in mainstream media for the longest of times. It was like the best kept secret within the Warframe community, yet it still had a solid player base that continuously grew year over year, and by the time the second Dream update dropped, Digital Extremes had already established Warframe's presence in the gaming space and they were here to stay. This success also allowed them to break into the Chinese gaming scene, which in itself is so hard for Western games to do. Now of course it isn't all roses. For those of you watching this video thinking I'm just blowing smoke up arses, over 10 years there have been plenty of downs within the Warframe community as well, with nerfs and changes over the years like E-Gate, Draco and Vivre AFK farming, infinite XP glitches that got players and of course YouTubers permanently banned, partner program drama that led to its collapse, official mods abusing power, Trinity getting nerfed on any day that ended in a Y, Saren then taking over and getting multiple nerfs, then buffs, then nerfs again, reverting nerfs after community outcry. You can see that nerfs plays a common part here. Data mines that led to cease and desist letters. The list goes on. But I would like to think, copium levels, that these are moments that Digital Extremes and its community as a whole have learned from in the past. I hope anyway. But let's move on. Following 3 months of successful closed beta, on the 21st of March 2013, Warframe entered open beta and announced its biggest update to date with Update 7, featuring a new snow planet, new Warframes, Saren, Banshee, and of course, Sentinel pets and a revamped mod system. It was that scary step into the unknown. While open betas, founder packs, and funding from your players is commonplace now, it wasn't back then, so there was a lot riding on its success. 2 months later, Rise of the Warlords dropped, which was another big update. They added the Grineer Galleon tileset, another ship outside of the Corpus tileset, which was the only one we had to date. It added Forma, which is still the foundation of upgrades in the game, as well as the threatening Stalker, which he was back then, not so much now, he's a bit of a kitten. Now, I mention these things because they played a huge part in the early experience of Warframe players. I'm not going to go over every update or the video will be far too long, but over the next few years they would add Captain Vor and his legendary dialogue, the Orokin Void, and of course Void Keys, may they rest in peace, Lephantis Damage 2.0, which took us away from rainbow builds and was the introduction of elemental combos, corrosive radiation and so on. They also brought us Kubros, a revamped new player experience, Arcwing, syndicates, and plenty of new warframes and weapons, but some updates are definitely worth mentioning. In March 2015, they would bring out Warframe's first 8-man raid, the Law of Retribution, where players would have to complete 3 sets of challenges, I say that word lightly, and eventually fight Veilbreaker at the end, giving you a chance to farm the first set of arcanes added into the game, which were seen as endgame at that time. Now, in July of the same year, they would add the Echoes of the Sentient update. Digital Extremes would remove coptering in favour of a new parkour system. When shown off initially, there was definite outcry within the community. We didn't like change and we were very used to coptering, but in actual practice, Parkour 2.0 was pretty fast, and once players got their hands on it, realised that it might actually be faster. It incorporated double jumping, bullet jumping, wall latch, and of course dashing, aim gliding and zip lines, and perhaps the most important thing that was added was the removal of stamina from the game. Until this point, Warframe had a stamina system for sprinting around and using melee weapons, and was also the reason why coptering was so popular, since it bypassed the annoying stamina drain. With the removal of stamina, the Parkour 2.0 changes were a lot easier for players to accept and get used to, as well as accept the removal of that coptering ability, which in reality a lot of the time just had you smacking face first into a wall. Now, update 17.9 would also bring the game's second raid out, the Jordas Verdict. While this was a better designed raid, it was riddled with bugs and exploits that Digital Extremes just never really got around to completely fixing. The number of problems versus the low population of raiders within the community eventually seen Digital Extremes removing raids from the game entirely, and to this day they still haven't returned and probably never will. Even though players still kind of request them back, but I'm not sure if that's just rose-tinted glasses, because honestly, they were a feckin' mess. Update 17 also brought the beginning, right? The Nata quest, which was Digital Extremes' first step into fleshing out and adding a proper narrative to the game. It was the building block upon which the current narrative of Warframe is formed, leading into what was by far one of the best quests in the game, hands down, the Second Dream. Now, up until this point, lore in Warframe was very much a jigsaw puzzle with small tidbits added over the years for the community to piece together, and like raids, it was a bit of a mess. Update 18 brought the Second Dream to the game. This was the main quest that serves as a continuation of the story that was started off in the Stolen Dreams event and the Nata quest, and it was the very first cinematic quest added. This quest was a turning point because the quest began to properly flesh out the origin story of the Tenno, as well as adding lore about the Sentients and the Stalker to the game. Now, the world building coupled with the music, the storytelling and the emotions that the story evoked in players were considered a bit of a masterstroke, and while it was a very ambitious update for Digital Extremes, it landed perfectly, surprising and quite frankly blowing the entire audience away. In the second dream, you were also introduced to your operator, the Tenno's true form, which was an absolute huge reveal. Playing through the second dream was an experience. The story was well crafted and delivered to the community. It showed the passion behind the team that delivered the update. And completing this quest gave the players access to the new focus system that was tied to your operator, and this was a pivotal point in Warframe's game's life cycle, since it set in stone the different playstyle of both your Warframe and your operator, but showing how, despite being vastly different, they both come together into one package. The focus system, with its 5 schools to master, allowed players to upgrade active and passive nodes, as well as 2 nodes per tree, which were universally active regardless of which focus school you were actively using at that time. At this point, it should be noted that the kind of updates that Warframe was receiving had shifted from an update every 2 weeks to longer breaks in between major content, while weapons, prime access packs, Tenno-gen updates and cosmetic updates were still being added quite regularly. Now this meant that the time between each major update had dramatically increased, but it was needed in order to create and deliver all of the content that came after Update 18. Now in November 2016 we received the follow-up quest to the second dream called The War Within. This was the next chapter of the narrative of Warframe. While the story of the second dream gives you the origin of the Tenno, The War Within expands upon that story, where it pushes the player to learn about your Tenno's past and unlock their true capabilities. Now, Update 18 and 19 were massive updates in terms of scope and ambition for Digital Extremes, since they expanded out the Warframe universe in a way that was not seen before now. Not only was the lore and storytelling of Warframe actually getting a little bit solid direction instead of just being random bits of lore brought together loosely, but the game was getting a solid base to build upon as well, with the integration of the operator mode tying in with Warframes and then eventually Archwing as well. Now these quests led up to Update 22, better known as the Plains of Eidolon. This was the biggest, most ambitious update created for Warframe by Digital Extremes. This update added a massive open world zone for players to run around and explore that featured a dedicated day and night cycle. They added mining, fishing, bounty hunting, incursion events that were randomized events during the day, and when night would hit, they would engage in an open world boss fight with an enormous Eidolon, the Terrorist, Terry. Digital Extremes even implemented Archwing as a deployable so that players could traverse the plains even faster. It was so different to anything we had from Warframe up to that point. The change in direction seen Warframe's player base increase by a substantial amount. Now the Plains of Eidolon, from a lore perspective, was an ancient battlefield where the Sentients fought to destroy the Orokin Tower that the Ostron people had called home. The Sentients failed and died out and left behind a graveyard throughout the landscape. Eventually, they would add the Gantalist and the Hydralist as 2 more Eidolons for players to hunt at night cycle as well. But after the Plains of Eidolon update, Update 23 rolled around in June 2018 with the third cinematic quest, which focused on the ambitious goal of telling Warframe's story in a completely different way than before. Now the Sacrifice is a solo-only main quest where you play as the operator in search of Lotus, who was taken by Ballas for unknown reasons. It also introduced the first Umbral Warframe, Excalibur Umbra, coming full circle. Now the quest does a great job at explaining the origins of your Warframes and how Ballas fits into the equation alongside your operators, Lotus and the Sentients. And the revelation that the Lotus herself was a sentient was dropped on the players like a ton of bricks towards the end of that quest, so it had got a shocking reveal. Now, while the Sacrifice was well received overall, there was some criticism that the story fell short compared to the Second Dream and The War Within, although honestly that's mostly subjective. The quality of content coming out was still at the same level that Digital Extremes had been putting out up to that point, and sure, while there may be some bugs, they were quickly patched out. Fast forward to July of the same year, Railjack was shown off at TennoCon 2018 as a sneak peek about what's on the horizon for Warframe, but we'll get into that in a minute. But in November 2018, almost a year after the Plains of Eidolon update, Warframe received its second open world to the game, or Valis, featuring a neon-themed rebel setting within the town of Fortuna. Now this update aimed to expand further on what Plains of Eidolon had already added to the game, but under a corpus theme. While the Plains featured sentient Eidolons as the boss fights, in Fortuna you were fighting Nef-Anyos or Mothers, giant mechanical spiders. So more open world boss fights, except that one Orb Mother who's still chilling in the jacuzzi to this day. Now Fortuna also featured a similar system to daily reputation grinds with all of the vendors. It also had fishing, mining and conservation. And after a whole year of farming reputation in the Plains of Eidolon, discontent was starting to be voiced a little bit about the grind and it being a bit tedious. Now the scale and scope of Fortuna was on a similar level to Eidolon, but now Digital Extremes had been given a bit of a warning from the players that they were starting to get a little bit burnt out on the daily reputation systems and the separation between the island content and its main body of missions. So there was no real connection between the two. Over the next few updates, we would see Eidolon visually remastered. We would also see the introduction of the Corpus Gas City as well as amalgams as an enemy type, while also adding a really good boss fight in the Ropa Lowlist, the Ropa Dopalist. Which brings us up to update 26, the Kuva Liches. Heavily inspired by the Nemesis system from Shadows of Mordor, Digital Extremes implemented a similar Kingpin system to Warframe, where you would focus on killing special units called Kuva Liches, blessed by the Twin Queens. Now you could either kill them or you could turn them over to your side by use of a hidden blade, the Parazon, totally not taken from Assassin's Creed. In a game where customization plays such a huge part within the community, Digital Extremes also added yet another layer of customization for players to chase in the form of ephemeras. Now you remember how Digital Extremes had teased Railjack back in July 2018 at TennoCon, right? Fast forward a year and a half later to update 26 and finally phase 1 involving getting a dry dock built in your clan's dojo and then working through the quest to build your Railjack piece by piece finally arrived. Finally we were getting ready to soar among the stars. This brought us up to update 27, Imperion. This was the update so many players were waiting for, going from playing Warframe on the ground to Arcwing to then flying your very own frigate, teammates who could help man the guns or pilot, to taking on bigger threats such as Balafomorians and Corpus Cruisers at launch. This was the framework for what was to come for the game's story progression, featuring your own pilotable Railjack. It featured different aspects of Railjack that was customizable, such as the armor, weaponry, engine, and of course even cosmetics, and featured a modding system to make your Railjacks even stronger. It also had its own damage system unique to Railjack. Of course, with a new Railjack and a new system comes new resources to gather and grind and farm as well, new enemies to fight, new tile sets to explore and much more, but also a lot of bugs. This is probably one of the messiest updates that I can remember to date with Warframe in my 9 to 10 years of covering it. It was not enjoyable for a very long period of time while they shipped hotfix after hotfix to try and fix it and make it more appealing to the community. On top of that, large portions of the community didn't enjoy Railjack and to this day still don't. From its gameplay to the high levels of grind it initially took to build your very own Railjack, to a lot of players it was seen as a much larger Arcwing system, so they discarded it to one side. While most of update 27 focused on the implementation of Railjack's hotfixes to fix bugs as well as optimization to improve the overall gameplay experience, it was also the prelude to Operation Scarlet Spear as a form of introduction to the new war, which was teased at TennoCon 2019 alongside the Duviri paradox. But Scarlet Spear also suffered from a lot of issues. It was supposed to be Squad Link, which was originally shown off during TennoCon 2018. Two teams worked together in tandem to take down a threat, one team into space, one team on the ground, but it didn't function that way at all. The team on the ground, its kills were generating codes that a group of Railjack players could then dip into for their Railjack part of that mission. But not enough players were doing, the Railjack mission, and in doing so, players often received their very own code from the ground while they ran the Railjack side of the mission. That was two major updates almost back to back that had been heavily criticised by Warframe's player base, and rightly so. Parvus Granum arrived with update 28, as did the Steel Path, but it was update 29 in August 2020 which added the third open world zone, this time an infested theme one called the Heart of Deimos. Just like Fortuna and the Plains, it featured a similar daily reputation system and activities in the open zone, but it also had the vaults in the depths of Deimos, which added a little bit of mystery to the update, like the mirror in the void where you could see the worm. But again, Deimos was another content island away from the main body of missions, something that at this point players were really fatigued with. However, this update also introduced a system that was to become the epicenter of builds for your Warframes in-game, the Helmet system. This allowed players to extract a single chosen ability from any Warframe to slot it into another Warframe in place of any one of their abilities, and in doing so completely changed the way that Warframe would play out. It would also see a flood of YouTube videos where people would just add gloom to things. Now, the Heart of Deimos update also added the story of the Entrati, which was a faction that was heavily tied to the core lore element of Warframe, and they also introduced another staple system, the Necromechs. These mechs were essentially needed in the olden days to fight against the sentients, so this was another layer of world building Digital Extremes added ahead of the new war's introduction. We also saw a new event being added ahead of the new war called the Orphex Venom, which was setting up the game for the culmination of a story 8 years in the making. Also, after 8+ years of content, eligible players were now finally able to hit the fabled Mastery rank 30. 8 years in the making, and Digital Extremes is still going strong with the introduction of Update 30, the Call of the Tempestarii, a space pirate-themed update. This was another solo quest that brought the Railjack and its latest rework in the previous update front and centre, cementing the role of Railjack being integral to the game's narrative leading into the new war, while Digital Extremes also finally added the corpus equivalent of the Kuva Liches, aka the Sisters of Parvus, which brings us to Update 31, the New War. All of the previous cinematic quests that built upon the story of Warframe would be concluded with the introduction of the New War. This was by far the biggest update that added a solo quest to Warframe that would take multiple hours and prevent players from accessing other activities until the quest was completed. This update was the culmination of the entire story of Warframe that had been told since the start of the Natah quest, giving players both answers and questions as well as closure for their operators, while introducing the building blocks for the next update, Veilbreaker, by allowing players to play as Grineer and Corpus units in the new war story mission. Now, the quest played out the events of a war that involved the entire solar system, and with the introduction of the Grineer and Corpus playable characters, Kal and Viso, it showed the grand scale of how the invasion affected everyone. But certain aspects of the quest also felt a little bit rushed at times, or needed explaining a little bit better. Ballas was a ruler, but there was no real signs of his empire anywhere after the quest was finished. Era went from bad guy to good guy out of the blue without any real showdown. We now have an eternalism multiverse where anything is possible, and Wally showing up at the end made everyone do a double take, but it closed the story for Lotus, Natah or Margulis and gave us steps forward towards the unknown. Who or what was Wally? Was he good or bad? Was he the wall or the guy on top of the wall? And what is next for Warframe? After returning in February 2022, Digital Extremes started working on releasing the next leg of the update, the Angels of the Zariman, which came out at the end of April. This update introduced the Zariman 10-0, the legendary ship, the origin of who we are, of where the operators came from, the ship that's half in and half out of the void. They added it as a playable semi-kind of open zone, with 3 new game modes, a narrative follow-up quest to the new war, as well as the introduction of the Incarnan evolving weapons. While this new zone still used the same daily reputation cap system as the other open world zones, it was different from the previous updates in the sense that the explorable zones were within the Zariman 10-0 and were all tied to the narrative of the people on board the ship, as well as the events after the new war. The new game modes were really well received and a nice change of pace to Warframe, given that some of the previous game modes such as Deception were kind of hit and miss. This update also saw the rework of the Eximus unit, introducing the Overguard mechanic, which was met with a mixed response. Now, the final update part of the new war before TennoCon 2022 was called the Echoes of the Zariman. This update added yet more Incarnan weapons to the game, new offerings from the Zariman vendors, and a ton of fixes, changes, buffs and nerfs, as well as optimization, but it leads us up to where we are right now, 10 years later. Veilbreaker, Update 32. Veilbreaker is set after the events of the new war. This update was aimed at showing what happened to the solar system at large and the effects of Ballas's actions, with the Archons and Narmer enslaving the people of the Origin system, and effectively sees the world through the eyes of Cal 175. This is what the new war was originally missing, that mark left on the solar system by Ballas as a ruler with his cult. You yet again get to play as Cal-175, the newest saviour of the Origin system, as he works alongside his brothers as you run weekly missions to free enslaved people under the rule of Narmer. For rewards, of course, because nothing is done for free. We can buy Archon shards, or you can choose to hunt them, because this update also introduced the Archon hunts, which are boss hunts that allow you to farm weekly additional Archon shards, shards that can further increase the power of your Warframes, a new kind of gem system, if you will, that can increase your health, your power, your shield, your cast speed, and so on for your Warframes, and of course you can equip 5 of them. But with the extension of Veilbreaker, we also received our 50th Warframe in Styanax, the Spartan hoplite themed Warframe. The next few extensions of Update 32 would also give us Varuna, the 51st Warframe, the wolf-themed frame from Joe Mads of Darksiders fame, and Wayfinders, as well as giving us Citrine, who is probably one of the best Warframes to be added into our arsenal in many, many years. But with 10 years comes the uncertain next step, the handing over of the dev team from the old guard to the new. Steve, Scott, Jeff and others have stepped away from Warframe to work on a new title called Soulframe, while Rebecca, Megan, Pablo and others have stepped into their roles to take Warframe onto its next journey, with Duviri and whatever is beyond that. As with the Plains at the time of its introduction, Duviri looks completely different to anything we've had yet, and whether it's a success or not, I guess only time will tell, but it does look different enough for it to be refreshing. Pace might be a bit slower, combat might be a bit different, but I'm hoping it will expand on the story more than anything, and the journey that we have been on with Warframe through over those 10 years. But with Duviri, Soulframe and now also Wayfinder on the horizon from Digital Extremes, there's way more pools for us to dip our toes into when it comes to free-to-play games. Now, this video was put together by myself and another content creator who covered Warframe a lot initially, Frozen Balls. But just to sum up a bit of our experience in the 10 years of Warframe from beta to now.
For me, I still remember the first few days in Warframe. Coming from Global Agenda, I was looking for a game to replace it. The servers were going down and activity was going down with it, and I was introduced to 2 games by friends, Firefall and Warframe. Sitting down and watching the trailer for the first time was incredible. This was by far one of the most unique game trailers that I'd ever seen, and I was instantly sold on what was being shown. I signed up for the closed beta and was one of the first few people to get accepted back in January 2013. Suffice to say, 10 years in and almost 16,000 hours of farming, gaming, trading and fashion framing, Warframe has left a rather permanent mark on my gaming career. It has shaped my expectations from game studios going forward and the sort of quality I expect in games that I want to play, whether we're talking narrative or gameplay mechanics. After all, when I got into Warframe, it was the mechanics and core gameplay loop that hooked me, not the story. That came later. It has been quite a journey as both a player and a content creator for Warframe, and I cannot wait to see where this ship will sail toward under Rebecca's leadership now. Also, perhaps Taylor's lust for killing Bolarolas will be sated, and they can live happily ever after too.
For me and my journey with Warframe, and of course the content that I was creating, Warframe was a game that I jumped into after years of raiding on World of Warcraft. I was completely burnt out, and it was just a unique and different game to anything I had played at that time. Its community was very, very welcoming, and at the time, I wasn't making videos. I was just looking for a game to take my mind off the struggles of day-to-day life. But then I started a hobby of making videos and covering the game, and here we are, 10 years later, all thanks to you guys who watch my content and put up with my severe inability to say certain words correctly. I look forward to what's up next, and to any of you who have chosen to watch my videos over the years, when I say thank you, I really mean it. You have no idea the impact that you have had on me and my family while covering this Space Ninja game. So 10 years is done, let's see where the journey takes us next. Have a great day, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you do us a favour and hit that like button, and as always, thanks for watching.